Okay, this is yet another YouTube video. This one's going to be a little different. It's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. And basically, as I've been exploring the history of the U.S. military railroad, especially that serving the armies around Petersburg at the end of the war, I've kind of come to the conclusion that there's a lot of hype about railroads in the Civil War, and railroads won the Civil War. I kind of have a slightly different opinion. No doubt they were critically important, both for the North and South for supplying the armies, but I see them as vulnerable. They were very vulnerable, and the real supply um, line that the South couldn't compete with was the northern navies that basically could provide supply almost anywhere that was navigable. There were points where the Confederates could block the rivers, make it difficult, but once the North established communications along a river line, basically they had that line of communications and supply, and it couldn't be broken. I think that was even more critical than the railroads. So that's my thesis, and that's why I got to looking into this. And I wanted to make sure I had the right train of thought, so I started investigating the episode was what made Sherman decide to abandon Atlanta and go to march to the sea, and what was going on there. And it turns out, once I started investigating, it was fascinating. Grant and Sherman communicated during this period after the capture of Atlanta till the time Sherman actually reached the sea exclusively by telegram, and I think most of these telegrams have been recorded and captured to history, and they're available online. So the messages that went back and forth are fascinating. So that's what I started investigating, and that's what this video is going to be about. What happened? What caused that decision to march to the sea take place? What were these guys thinking? And the as you'll see if you listen to this video, the discussion was rather open between Grant and Sherman, and it was kind of obvious what they were dealing with and why they made that decision. So this is the first video. It's basically, I'm going to be quoting a lot of those messages in the telegram, or at least parts of them. Hopefully it doesn't get too dry here. But so this is the first video in this series, and it's a series about using people's own words to describe history rather than paraphrasing or interpreting. And of course, during this YouTube video, I'm taking fragments of telegrams. I'm not taking them all, but the telegrams, the text is there and quite available to anybody that wants to research further. And I think I'm picking out the important pieces to make this point that railroads, though vitally important, were vulnerable supply lines, and they weren't the answer and the reason why the North won the war, but they were a part of it. So anyway, this is number one, to make Georgia howl. To set the stage, the situation mid-September 1864, in August, Admiral Farragut and General Granger was under General Canby, who controlled the federal forces in the western part of basically the Trans-Mississippi area, have taken the Confederate defenses protecting Mobile Bay, closing Mobile, which was still, Mobile, the city itself, was still under Confederate control, but it wasn't useful as a viable destination for blockade runners because the Union had captured Mobile Bay. Price's Confederate force was invading Missouri. Their hope was to get Missouri to switch to the Confederate side. So he's in the early stages of this invasion. Sherman's army is taking Atlanta, just taking it at the end of August. And General Hood, Confederate General Hood, is responding by beginning to operate against Sherman's supply lines. Grant is besieging Lee at Petersburg, and he has been since mid-June. He's periodically conducting what I would call limited offensives, which gain ground and continue to put pressure on Lee. But Union forces are taking heavy casualties in the process. Early's offensive, Lee does manage to break away. Part of the goal of Grant is to keep Lee from affecting things elsewhere. However, Lee does manage to break a part of his army away under Early, and Early launches an offensive into Maryland, and it's checked by Sheridan as Grant basically sends Sheridan and the 6th Corps up to Washington to say, basically to stop the offensive. And Sheridan's now starting to move against Early, and they'll be moving up the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. And very critically, the presidential election's coming up on November 7th. That's, we're talking mid-September, so that's less than 2 months away. And I think the election's still in doubt, even though Sherman's got Atlanta. And Lincoln himself is rather pessimistic. So let's start with the first telegram. There's more than these, but I'm just picking the highlights. On September 10th, Sherman telegraphed to Grant, "To operate further out in the railroad, it takes so many men to guard, and even then it is nightly broken by the enemy's cavalry that swarm about us. Macon is a distant 103 miles, and Augusta 175 miles. If I could be sure of finding provisions and ammunition at Augusta or Columbus, Georgia, I can march to Midgenville and compel Hood to give up Augusta or Macon, and could then turn on the other. The country will afford forage and many supplies, but not enough in any one place to admit a delay. In scattering for forage, we lose a great many men picked up by the enemy's cavalry. If you can manage to take Savannah River as high as Augusta, or the Chattahoochee as far as Columbus, I can sweep the whole state of Georgia. Otherwise, I would risk our whole army by going too far from Atlanta." So just to paraphrase, what he's saying is he's at Atlanta, but to go further into Georgia, Macon or one of these other towns, it's just too far to protect his railroad lines. So he's just trying to tell Grant, if I can get support from you coming up these rivers, he can go through Georgia, but it's very risky to go too much farther from Atlanta. He knows he's at the end of his supply lines. And a couple days later, he telegraphs to Grant again, "I don't understand whether you propose to act against Savannah direct from Fort Pulaski or by way of Florida or from the direction of Mobile. If you can take Savannah by a sudden coup de main, it would be valuable." So Sherman's basically looking for support. He wants to continue pushing through the Confederacy, but he's basically asking for help from Grant, who's got these mobile forces. He's got a force down by Fort Pulaski. He's got one. They've just taken Mobile, and they also have forces in the Carolinas and Virginia that they could come down, and he's looking for help. So Grant, the same day, Grant telegraphs Sherman on September 12th. I propose when I do move to extend my left as to control what is now the South Side or Lynchburg and Petersburg Railroad. Then, if possible, to keep the Danville Railroad cut. At the same time this move is made, I want to send a force of from 6,000 to 10,000 men against Wilmington. The way I propose to do this is to land the men north of Fort Fisher and hold that point. At the same time, a large naval fleet will be assembled there, and the ironclads will run the batteries as they did at Mobile. What you are to do with the forces at your command I do not exactly see. The difficulties of supplying your army, except when they are constantly moving beyond where you are, I plainly see. If it had not been for Price's movements, Canby could have sent 12,000 more men to Mobile. From your command on the Mississippi, an equal number could have been taken. With these forces, my idea would have been to divide them, sending one half to Mobile, the other half to Savannah. You can then move, as proposed in your telegram, so as to threaten Macon and Augusta equally. Whichever one abandoned by the enemy you could take and open up a new base of supplies. So here's what we've got is Grant's explaining his strategy to get Lee out of Richmond and defeat Lee, but he's also considering Price's movements. As I said in the beginning, Price is moving into Missouri, so that's diverted a lot of forces to Missouri to stop Price. So that's prevented them from reinforcing Mobile or even go to Savannah. And you can see he's also thinking about cutting off Wilmington. Wilmington's a key supply port for Lee's army. From blockade runners coming into Wilmington. It's fairly close to Virginia in the operations there, so that's why he's also considering capturing Wilmington and cutting it off. But even Grant can see that Sherman can't extend his army anymore on the current supply lines. And then in reaction to losing Atlanta, President Davis traveled to Macon, Georgia, and gave a speech, a public speech, which included the keys to Confederate strategy. And there's a couple key phrases in this speech. And the one is, the fate that befell the army of the French Empire and its retreat from Moscow will be reacted. Our cavalry and our people will harass and destroy his army as the Cossacks that of Napoleon, and the Yankee general, like him, will escape with only a bodyguard. And then later on he says, how can this be the most speedily effected? By the absentees of Hood's army returning to their posts. And will they not? Can they see the banished exiles? Can they hear the wail of their suffering country, women and children, and not come? So there's two big aspects to the speech. And one is he understands that Sherman's got a vulnerable supply route, and they could be cut off and destroyed. And the other aspect is it's clear that he would say this in a public speech. He's pleading with the soldiers to return to their posts. So there must be a lot of desertions and absenteeism going on. And so he's pleading with the troops to come back to their posts so they can defeat. He's got a plan. So help me with this. My plan is what he's saying to the troops. Now the other key thing is this was a public speech. So Sherman finds out about this speech, and therefore he knew the Confederate strategy. He knew their position, what they were planning on doing. And I think that's important too. When you know the enemy's plans, you can react to them better. So Sherman has several options. Maintain Atlanta as a forward pace, attempt to pursue and destroy Hood and Forrest. Hood and Forrest are the two generals operating on his supply lines. So he could maintain Atlanta, try to maintain that railroad, and attempt to pursue and destroy Hood and Forrest. Or he could destroy Atlanta and the Western Atlantic Railroad, which is the railroad that runs from Chattanooga to Atlanta, and basically cut his supply line and marched to either Mobile, Charleston, Savannah, and actually there's another route he could go, but so anyway, so this is kind of the options that he sees he has. And here's a map kind of showing the strategic situation in mid-September. You've got Price going up into Missouri on the from Arkansas. You've got Hood and Forrest actively operating on Sherman's supply lines in a kind of unpredictable manner. And you've got Early detached from Lee moving up to Washington. And Grant has Sheridan responding. And then these dotted lines are potential plans. Grant can send troops down to Wilmington or down to Savannah, and you can see there's already pockets of Union occupation along the coast, which are supplied by the Navy. Then you've got Sherman kind of in the middle of the Confederacy, dead center in the middle, and he could go any one of a number of ways. Back to Mobile, to take Mobile proper, east to Savannah, even to Charleston, or down to Florida. Or he could just try to defeat Hood and Forrest and protect his gains. So that's kind of the strategic situation. So here's Sherman's situation. On the 26th, which is like a couple weeks after the previous telegraphs, Sherman telegraphs Grant again. I've already sent one division, Newton's, to Chattanooga, and another, courses, to Rome. Our armies are much reduced, and if I send back much more, I will not be able to threaten Georgia much. So here he's got this dilemma, trying to defend his supply lines, which he's already, sending troops back, or get into Georgia even more. So 5 days later, on October 1st, he sends another telegram. Hood is evidently on the west side of the Chattahoochee below Sweetwater. If he tries to get on my road this side of the Ottawa, I shall attack him. But if he goes over to the Selma and Talladega road, why would it not do for me to leave Tennessee to the force which Thomas has, and the reserves soon to come to Nashville, and for me to destroy Atlanta, and then march across Georgia to Savannah or Charleston, breaking roads and doing irreparable damage? We cannot remain on the defensive. So here's Sherman starting to think differently. He's already detached a large portion of his forces. The Union High Command is sending reinforcements to Tennessee. And that's the reserve, soon to come to Nashville. And he's thinking, well, I can't just stay here and try to defend this railroad. I'm not getting anywhere. So maybe I could destroy Atlanta and march across Georgia. And he's thinking of going east now, not to Mobile or south of Florida. So he's thinking, remaining on the defensive, it's just not going to get anywhere. It's not going to end the war. So here we have, I've been looking in the papers, Grant's papers is where the source of all these telegrams is, although I think a lot of them are also in the official records. There's not much from Washington, either Halleck or Stanton or Lincoln. But finally, on October 2nd, General Halleck telegraphs Grant. And there's a big, long telegram. And it says, sometime since General Sherman has asked my opinion in regard to his operations after the capture of Atlanta. While free to give the advice to the best of my ability, I felt a duty to refer him to you for instructions. Not being advised of your views on that subject, I presume from his dispatches that you have already corresponded upon the subject, and perhaps his plan of future operations has already been decided upon. At one time, he seemed more decidedly of the opinion that he ought to operate by Montgomery and Selma and connect himself with Canby and Farragut on the Alabama River, thus severing the northern part of Georgia and Alabama and all of Mississippi from the rebel Confederacy. This view was taken in his letters to General Canby, copies of which were sent to the Adjutant General's office. And in this opinion I fully concurred, so I wrote both to him and to Canby, directing them, however, to make no important movements till they received your instructions. I judge from a dispatch just received from General Sherman that he's now proposing to move eastwardly toward Augusta or Millen, expecting to connect with the coast by the Savannah River. Whether this is simple a suggestion or a change of opinion on his part, or the result of his consultation with you, or of your orders to him, I have no means of knowing. All I wish to say or know upon the subject is that if any definitive plans have been adopted, it is desirable that the Secretary of War or myself, Secretary of War being Stanton, or myself, should be informed of that plan as early as possible. Large requisitions have been received within the last day or two from General Canby's staff officers for water transportation, and quartermaster, commissary, and medical stores sent to Mobile or Pensacola for an army of 30 or 40,000 men. Indeed, in a single article of forage, the amount asked for is more than can be possibly furnished in the northern and eastern states, and more than all the available sea-going vessels in northern ports could float. On receiving these requisitions, I directed General Meigs, he's the quartermaster general, to take active measures to fill them so far as possible, but to make no shipments till further orders. Now, if General Sherman is going to move east to connect with the coast by the Savannah River, these stores should not be shipped to Mobile or Pensacola, but to Hilton Head, and transportation be sent to New Orleans to move all available troops to that point. Moreover, operations at Mobile should in that case be limited to a mere demonstration, continued only so long as they may serve to deceive the enemy. It is exceedingly important that some definitive conclusion be arrived at as early as possible. For the expenses of water transportation, especially of the demurrage of large fleets, are perfectly enormous. So here we have Halleck weighing in, and it's clear he's out of the loop to some extent of what's going on. And since him and General Meigs are got to supply these armies wherever they go, he wants to know what's going on. So it's interesting. Halleck has a very mixed reputation in the Civil War, and it's clear he's not really in the loop, which probably shows why he has this mixed reputation. But the other thing I'd like to point out is over these last several weeks, there's no messages between Lincoln and Grant that I have found, or to Sherman. So he's probably just monitoring things in the telegraph office, military telegraph office in Washington, but he's not weighing in as far as I can tell. which I find interesting. And so there's more to Halleck. And so Halleck's recommending that they go to Mobile. And this is his reasons. And so he continued with this telegram. Perhaps it may be desirable that I should give my reasons in brief for concurring with General Sherman in his first proposed plan of operations. In the first place, that line of connection with the coast is the shortest and most direct. That's going to Mobile. By cutting off a smaller slice of rebel territory is not so directly exposed and leaves a smaller force to attack in the rear. It does not leave Tennessee and Kentucky so open to rebel raids. The Alabama River is more navigable for our gunboats than the Savannah. This line is more defensible for General Canby's troops than the other. Montgomery, Selma, and Mobile are in a military point of view more important than Augusta, Millen, and Savannah. Mobile can be more easily captured than Savannah. And eighth, this line will bring within our control a valuable and more important section of the country than by Savannah. There is a section of country from 50 to 150 miles wide extending from Selma west to Meridian and hence north on both sides of the Tobigny to Columbus, Aberdeen, and Oklahoma, more rich in agricultural products than any equal extent of the country in the Confederacy. Slave labor has been very little disturbed in this section, and the large crops of this year are being collected in Demopolis, Selma, and Montgomery and other points for use for the rebel army. By moving upon that line, they will be converted to our use or be destroyed. By moving on Augusta, they will be left for the use of Hood's forces. And so, finally, Halleck says, I do not write this for the purpose of influencing your adoption of a particular plan of campaign or of changing your decision if you have adopted any plan, but simply to urge you to an early decision, if you've not already made one. It is proper, however, to remark that I have taken every possible means to obtain correct information on the subject and present these conclusions only after thorough examination and the most mature consideration. So here we have Halleck weighing in, but he's kind of out of the loop. But he's kind of coming up with an academic solution to the problem. And so there's more things going on. So General Wilson has been sent out west to fix or restore the Union cavalry to effective operation. And he telegraphed to General Rawlins, who's Grant's, I believe he's the chief of staff at City Point, on October 4th. I arrived here late last night on my way to take command of General Sherman's cavalry. As a matter of course, I'm not well enough informed as to its condition to say exactly what will be necessary to render it entirely efficient, but I'm confident a number of new officers to command the brigades and divisions and a thorough organization similar to that of the cavalry in the East will be needed. So basically, and this is not well understood, Sherman's cavalry is not in good shape, and Forrest is giving him fits. So Sherman telegraphs Grant on October 9th. It will be a physical impossibility to protect this railroad now that Hood, Forrest, and Wheeler and the whole batch of devils are turned loose without home or habitation. So in other words, Hood, Forrest, and Wheeler are now just raiding his railroad line at will. He doesn't have an effective cavalry force that can counter him. So this is a big problem. And here we are, almost a month since the first telegram I talked about, in like 6 weeks since he took Atlanta. So on October 5th, there's a battle in Alatuna Pass. and it's part of Hood's campaign to break the railroad. The battle was an attempt by a Confederate division under Samuel French to take the railroad and supply base, defended by a division-sized unit under General John Corse. Now, Allatoona Pass is located about halfway between Chattanooga and Atlanta. The Confederates failed to take the supply base, but it was a very near thing, and both sides suffered severe casualties. It was one of the more costly battles in terms of percentage of troops killed, wounded, or captured of the war. But the Confederates were repulsed that time. And so that's important to know that, these the conflicts are going on along the railroad. Sherman telegraphed Grant on October 9th, a few days later, "I propose we break up the road from Chattanooga and strike out with wagons for Midgenville, Macon, and Savannah. Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy it. But the utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia howl." So here on October 9th, he's finally realizing a military victory is exceedingly difficult. He telegraphs Grant again on October 11th. "We cannot remain here on the defensive. With 25,000 men and bold cavalry, the bold cavalry he can constantly break my road. I would prefer to make a wreck of the road in the country from Chattanooga to Atlanta." So he doesn't have an effective cavalry force. The Confederates do. They're making it very difficult for him to come up with a strategy to end the war and even comfortably stay in Atlanta. So Grant telegraphs back. Actually, this telegraph and the previous one, So Grant telegraphs back on October 11th. "Does it not look as if Hood was going to the invasion of Middle Tennessee, using the Mobile and Ohio and Memphis and Charleston roads to supply his base on the Tennessee about Florence or Decatur? If he does this, he ought to be met and prevented from getting north of the Tennessee. If you were to cut loose, I do not believe you would meet Hood's army, but would be bushwhacked by all the men, little boys, and such railroad guards as are still left at home. Hood would probably strike for Nashville, thinking by going north he could inflict greater damage upon us than we could upon the enemy by going south. If there is any way of getting at Hood's army, I would prefer that, but I must trust to your own judgment. I find I shall not be able to send a force from here to act with yours on Savannah. Your movements, therefore, will be independent of mine, at least until the fall of Richmond takes place." Okay, so here Grant's saying, "I can't help you with Savannah. I think it's better off you deal with Hood rather than just march through Georgia." So he's very concerned about Hood. He believes Hood's going to march north. Sherman, at the same time, is telegraphing Grant. And he's saying, "Hood moved his army from Palmetto Station across by Dallas and Cedartown and is now on the Coosa south of Rome. He threw one corps on my road at Ackworth, and I was forced to follow. I hold Atlanta with the 20th Corps and have strong detachments along my line. These reduce my active force to a comparatively small army. We cannot remain here on the defensive. With 25,000 men and the bold cavalry he can constantly break my road. I would infinitely prefer to make a wreck of the road in the country from Chattanooga to Atlanta, including the latter city. Send back my wounded, worthless, and with my effective army move through Georgia, smashing things to the sea. Hood may turn to Tennessee and Kentucky, but I believe he would be forced to follow me. Instead of being on the offensive, I would be on the offensive. Instead of guessing what he means to do, he would have to guess at my plans. The difference in war is full 25%. So at the same time, Grant's saying, defeat Hood, take care of Hood, don't let him invade the North. Sherman's saying, I want to go to the sea. I can't stay on the defensive. I need to take the initiative. And he also thinks that Hood's going to follow him, although he's not completely sure. So anyway, Grant telegraphs Sherman back the next day. Your dispatch of today is received. If you are satisfied the trip to the sea coast can be made holding the line of the Tennessee River firmly, you may make it, destroying all the railroads south of Dalton or Chattanooga as you think best. So Grant's giving him the okay to go ahead, despite his concerns. And he telegraphs Sherman again the next day. On reflection, I think better of your proposition. I think it would be much better to go south than to be forced to come north. You will no doubt clean the country where you go of railroad tracks and supplies. I would also move every wagon, horse, mule, and hoof of stock, as well as the Negroes. As far as arms can be supplied from either surplus on hand or by capture, I would put them in the hands of the Negro men. Give them such organization you can. They will be of some use. So here's Grant realizes Sherman wants to go to the sea, and he's giving him the okay, and he's saying, he's even saying arm the ex-slaves, the Negroes. So, okay, now Secretary of War Stanton weighs in. So, up till now, there's been a whole month of telegrams we've gone through here, and we've heard nothing from Lincoln or Stanton. But Stanton telegraphs Grant on October 12th. The President feels much solicitude in respect to Sherman's proposed movement and hopes it will be maturely considered. The objections stated in your telegram of last night impressed him with much force, and a misstep by Sherman might be fatal to his army. This much he, the President, directed me to say to you when I saw him this evening. Although I find on reaching the office that you now think better of the plan, you should know how he feels on a point so vital. So we don't even hear directly from President Lincoln. We hear indirectly through Stanton, which I find interesting. But President's telling Stanton, I'm worried. This is a very risky operation. Make sure those guys know what they aren't going to mess up. And you got to remember, the election's less than a month away. If Sherman loses an army, this could be the end of, the war, his presidency or the war. So the next day, Grant telegraphs Stanton back. On more mature reflection, I believe Sherman's proposition is the best that can be adopted. With the long line of railroad in the rear of Atlanta, Sherman cannot maintain his position. If he cuts loose, destroying the road from Chattanooga forward, he leaves a wide and destitute country for the rebels to pass over before reaching territory now held by us. Thomas could retain force to meet Hood by giving up the road from Nashville to Decatur and hence to Stevenson, and leave Sherman still forced to meet his armies if it took the other and most likely course. Such an army as Sherman has, and with such a commander, it will be hard to corner or capture. So here he's saying either Thomas or Sherman could handle Hood, but he just doesn't feel like that railroad line can be, it's not a long-term solution. So I think this is kind of what I'm getting to my thesis is railroads were critically important for supplying armies, especially those that didn't have a naval base. But they were vulnerable, very vulnerable. And the officers in general knew it. So on October 16th, Sherman telegraphed Grant. I got the dispatch in cipher. Now all these communications were encrypted, and although the rebels had plenty of opportunity to tap into the telegraph lines. They never broke the cipher. They never put a major effort into it. There were some minor efforts to break the ciphers, but they never were able to. So these were pretty secure communications. So unlike Sherman, who knows what Hood's task is because of Jeff Davis's speech, the Confederates really don't know what the Northern armies are going to do. So anyway, Sherman tells Grant, I got dispatch in cipher about providing me a place to come out on saltwater, but the cipher is imperfect and I cannot make out whether Savannah or Mobile should be the point preferred. But I also want to know if you're willing that I should destroy Atlanta and the railroad. Hood broke 8 miles of road at Big Shanty and about 15 from Resaca to the tunnel. The break at Big Sandy is repaired, but the other will take some time. I now have taken a position where I don't care which way he moves. I think the rebels will now go back south. And Grant telegraphs Sherman back. The moment you have started south, stores will be shipped to Hilton Head where there are transports ready to take them to meet you at Savannah. In case you go south, I would not propose holding anything south of Chattanooga, certainly not south of Dalton. Destroy in such case all military value in Atlanta. So now, the thought is they're going. But Grant's on November 1st, still worried. Do you not think it advisable now that Hood has gone so far north to entirely settle him before starting on your proposed campaign? With Hood's army destroyed, you can go where you please with impunity. I believed and still believe that you had better started south whilst Hood was in the neighborhood, or if you had been forced to go after you. Now that he's so far away, he might look upon the chase as useless and go in one direction while you are pushing in the other. If you can see the chance for destroying Hood's army, attend to that first and make your other move secondary. So Grant's still worried about Hood's army. Sherman telegraphs Grant the next day. If I could hope to overhaul Hood, I would. No single army can catch him, and I'm convinced the best results will follow from thwarting Jeff Davis's cherished plan of making me leave Georgia. So Hood doesn't think he can catch him anyway. And to finally summarize all his thoughts, in early November, Sherman wrote a 1,500-word essay. I described this as an essay because it's more than a letter. It covered the events since his capture of Atlanta and the reasoning behind his decision to march to Savannah in detail. It was telegraphed to Grant on November 6th. And here's a couple of highlights of that 1,500-word essay. In regard to Davis's speech, the whole burden of his song consisted in the statement that Sherman's communications must be broken and his army destroyed. Now, it is a well-settled principle that if we can prevent this succeeding in his threat, we defeat him, and we derive all the moral advantages of victory. Regarding his strategy, I feel compelled to what is usually a mistake in war, divide my forces, send a part back to Tennessee, retaining the balance here. So he's divided these forces. He knows it's a risk, but he feels like he had to do it. And regarding his priorities, he admits the first object should be the destruction of the army. So that should be the military priority. But he's not going to make that his first object here. His likely departure date. I've employed the last 10 days in running to the rear, the sick, the wounded, the worthless, and all the vast amount of stores accumulated by our army in the advance, aiming to organize this branch of the army into 4 well-commanded corps, encumbered only by 1 gun to 1,000 men, and provisions and ammunition, which can be loaded up on our mule teams so that we can pick up and start on the shortest notice. I reckon by the 10th instance, this end will be reached. And by that date, I will also have all the troops all paid. The presidential election is over and out of our way, and I hope the early storms of November are now prevailing. Will also give us a chance of long periods of fine weather for campaigning. I wonder, although it's not written, whether he purposely waited for the presidential election to end before he left, just in case disaster occurred. And then the political nature of Sherman's plans. This is still part of this 1,500-word essay. I propose to act in such a manner against the material resources of the South as to utterly negate Davis's boasted threat and promises of protection. If we can march a well-appointed army right through his territory, it is a demonstration to the world, foreign and domestic, that we have a power which Davis cannot resist. This may not be war, but rather statesmanship. Nevertheless, it is overwhelming to my mind that there are thousands of people abroad and in the South who will reason thus. If the North can march an army right through the South, it is proof positive that the North can prevail in this contest, leaving only open the question of its willingness to use that power. Now, Mr. Lincoln's election, which is assured, coupled with the conclusion thus reached, makes a complete logical whole. Even without a battle, the result operating upon the minds of sensible men would produce fruits more than compensating for the expense, trouble, and risk. So in other words, going back to the other thing, splitting the army, making the march through Georgia the priority, not the defeat of Hood's army, he's basically going with a political solution here. And he knows it. Not a military solution. And why he went to Savannah instead of the Gulf of Mexico, I think this is very interesting. The first will carry me across the only east and west railroad remaining in the Confederacy, which would be destroyed and therefore thereby sever the communications between the armies of Lee and Beauregard. Beauregard at this point commanded the Confederate armies in the Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana area. He was the overall commander, but he was kind of more of a bureaucratic commander rather than a field commander. Incidentally, I might destroy the enemy's depots at Macon and Augusta and reach the seashore at Charleston or Savannah, from either of which points I could reinforce our armies in Virginia. So he's also understanding if he marches east and gets east and comes on the rear or can be reinforced Grant against Lee would probably be doomed. And the final plans, I will give you notice by telegraph of the exact time of my departure. General Stedman is here to clear the road back to Chattanooga, and I will see that the road is broken completely between the Etowah and Chattahoochee, including their bridges, and Atlanta itself is utterly destroyed. So this is basically, Sherman's got his plan, it's all in his head, and he's basically making it a political decision, but it's partly based on the fact he just can't maintain, the expense of maintaining the supply line to Atlanta is just, it's not going to win him the war, just occupying Atlanta, and he can't go farther. So he really decides if we want to win this war, we got to take a chance. So just to summarize what follows after Sherman's march and during the march, President Lincoln wins the presidential election, of course. Sherman sets off for Savannah on November 15th. Thomas defeats Hood on December 15, 16 at the Battle of Nashville, which renders Hood's army ineffective. So splitting the army was a calculated risk, but it paid off. Sherman captures Savannah on December 21st, like a week after Hood's defeated. Sherman starts maneuvering toward the Carolinas starting on December 30th. And Fort Fisher is captured by amphibious assault on January 15th. and Wilmington, North Carolina, that vital port, especially vital to Lee's army, is cut off from the sea. And then Sherman starts marching through the Carolinas. He captures Columbia, South Carolina on February 17th. Charleston falls on the 18th. Actually, they evacuate because they're cut off from the rest of the Confederacy, so they evacuate. Now, the reinforced remnants of Hood's army under Johnson lose the Battle of Bentonville, which is one of the last large battles of the war in 1860, March. And at that point, Sherman, basically can't be beaten. And then from March to April, General Wilson has reinvigorated the Federal cavalry in the West, and they make a march through Alabama and Georgia. Very similar to Sherman's march, except by cavalry. And at this point, the force is not strong enough to defeat him. Grant takes Richmond on April 3rd. Lee attempts to join Johnson. Maybe together, he's thinking Johnson and Lee together can defeat Sherman and then turn on Grant, or one or the other. But Grant cuts him off at Appomattox, and Lee has to surrender. Mobile falls on April 12th to General Canby, and Johnson surrenders April 26th. So basically, once Sherman sets out on this march, it's just like a set of dominoes. Just Confederate disaster after disaster, one after another. It's remarkable how fast the Confederate falls. And so here's the previous map showed these Confederate invasions up to, through the Shenandoah Valley, an attempt to take Washington, and attempt to cut Sherman's supply lines, and then an attack into Tennessee, which Thomas turns back. Wilson does his raid through Alabama and Georgia. Canby takes Mobile. Sherman takes Savannah and then marches through the Carolinas. Grant gets an expedition to take Wilmington. So if you look at all this is happening, these armies are basically marching at will through the South and just taking any place they please, basically, at this point. So basically, the effect of this march to the sea and this decision to march, is, I maintain, basically ended the war, because the Confederates basically had no answer. Grant wrote a letter to one of his acquaintances in Illinois, and in the letter he says, "In 3 more weeks, I do not believe there will be a rebel army in the field capable of resisting the advance of 10,000 cavalry." He wrote that on February 24th. And maybe that's not quite true, because I think Lee's army could have certainly resisted the cavalry. Maybe Johnson's army could have. But by the end of April, certainly the Confederates had no force, no answer for the Union offensives. And first of all, I've got a few sources here. I've got the papers of Ulysses S. Grant contain almost all these telegrams. Davis's speech, which I think is an important speech, is at this site, and then the map I picked up at and added the arrows to it. So that's this video. I hope it's interesting and informative, kind of how the railroads were critical, but they weren't an answer. And if you look back at what's happening, a lot of it has to do with supply by sea. And once they are too far away from the water, the armies are pretty much going on raids, and they're basically unable to maintain themselves without enormous difficulty. So that's this week's or this version of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and talk to you later.